You'll all remember towards the end of 2011 when the population of the world hit 7 billion. There was all kinds of writhing and wailing and gnashing of teeth about how we had not yet figured out how to control the world's population. Strong concerns from women's rights organizations that the issue of reproductive rights had not yet been successfully addressed. Concern from environmentalists that we were, of course, going to destroy ourselves. And the Malthusians came out of their holes in the ground to respond triumphantly to the media when the world did hit 7 billion people. I had an entirely different reaction to that news. It strikes me that hitting 7 billion is an extraordinary achievement for humankind. In order to have reached that size of a population, we needed to learn how to feed ourselves. We needed to learn how to avoid killing ourselves in giant numbers. We needed to learn how to govern ourselves. We needed to learn how to look after health concerns and public health sanitation concerns. For humanity to reach 7 billion people strikes me as an absolutely extraordinary achievement. So to me, this was a cause for celebration as opposed to a cause for despair. And I was remembering, for those of you sitting over there, one of the benefits of getting older is that you remember bizarre things that happened in the past. There was a book that was written by an American named Paul Ehrlich in 1968 called The Population Bomb. And Ehrlich's attempt was to terrify all of us into thinking that by the mid-1970s, so he was talking about within 10 years, that we were going to be unable to feed ourselves, that the world would see mass famines, that there would be, as a result of extraordinary levels of food shortages, there would be wars, there would be rioting, that people would be robbing each other for food, and then at the end of this cataclysm, people were going to be eating each other. And it was this unbelievable prediction that caught the imagination of the entire planet. And so you had all kinds of population policies brought in, including the famous one-child policy in China, and so on and so forth. Well, of course, this was one of the least successful predictions I think ever made. What Ehrlich did not take seriously enough, even though it had begun a good 10 years before he wrote the book, was the Green Revolution in agriculture, which increased food output by roughly 2.5 times in the periods around 1968. And I don't know how many of you remember what the world's population was in 1968. Any guesses? Anyone know the answer? 3.5 billion, so exactly half of what it is today. Now, Ehrlich was interviewed when the world's population hit 7 billion and was asked, what does he think? What about his prediction? And he said, well, okay, I got the timing a bit off, but I'm still going to be proven right. We will be eating each other before too long. Why? Because the Green Revolution depended on oil and natural gas supplies to produce the fertilizers that powered the Green Revolution, the fertilizers and the machinery, and we're going to run out of oil very, very soon. So you watch, we're going to be changing what's on our plates before long. Well, then along came fracking technologies and shale gas findings, and of course now the world is awash in oil. So I find this kind of an amusing thing, Paul Ehrlich arising again, and I'm sure he's going to be proven wrong. Now, hitting 7 billion by itself, I don't think is the story. What's most interesting, it seems to me, are some of the things, of course, that Ahmet has already referred to, and that has to do not with the total population of the world, but where people live, the distribution of this population. And we know that it, of course, is very unevenly distributed, not only in terms of where people are, but the way age groups are distributed around the planet. Now, a couple of interesting things are going on, and these are very general trends, but I think trends that are going to matter a great deal as time goes by. And one is the shift in, and Ahmed has referred to this, the shift in, as it were, the center of the globe's population away from developing countries, away from developed countries to developing countries. So if you think about these things in very broad terms, in 1700, roughly 20% of the world's population lived in developed countries, and at that time it was primarily Europe. By 1913, by the way, I'm not a researcher. I take all these numbers from other people. By 1913, roughly 33% of the world's population lived in developed countries. By 2003, that figure of 33% had dropped to 17%. And if you look at UN projections, the ones that the Population Division puts out, by 2050, only 12% of the world's population will live in developed countries. Now, this is an extraordinary shift. And go back to 1700, where it was 20%. This is an extraordinary change in where people are living in the world. Now, some people argue that this will have consequences for not only relative proportion of the population, but relative proportion of global GDP. And some similar numbers, again, drawn from other people. In 1800, 32% of global GDP was held in developed countries. By 1950, that figure had risen to 68% of world's GDP was held in developed countries. 2003, that figure had dropped to 47%. And projections that I've seen would suggest that by 2050, that percentage will fall below 30%, which is below that of 1800. So a dramatic change in the economic centers of the globe is expected. And this, people who know these things far better than I do, is a consequence of this shift in where people are living, shift in proportion of the population. Now, Ahmed referred to consequences for the labor supply in Europe. But here's what I think is an extraordinary figure. If you take, and this is not a projection, this is now, if you take the total population in the world, age 15 and under, so this is a major chunk of the world's future workforce, so age 15 and under, right now, 90% of these people live in developing countries. Now, this strikes me as having extraordinary consequences for many things, including migration, but for the economic future of developed countries. And most of us in this room live in countries that are going to experience these effects. So we do talk a lot about population aging, but to a large extent what we're talking about is the effects on healthcare costs, the effects on pension costs. Ahmed, I think, is absolutely right to point out to us that migration is not something that is going to solve national aging problems. And you did say, quite rightly, that migration accelerates population aging, and that's for obvious reasons. When a migrant enters the population of a country, he or she does not do so at the age of 0, which is what babies do. They're usually considerably older than 0. So yes, migration has it contributes to population aging as opposed to reducing it. Now, if you look at some of these things, if you look at population aging, it's going to have, at least it seems to me, some serious economic impacts. When you look at the nature of modern economies in the developed world, they're based less and less, they're rooted less and less in physical labor and more on knowledge-based activities, on innovation, on entrepreneurship, on investment. And if you think about these things, innovation, if you think about investment and entrepreneurship, these are things that we tend to associate with younger populations, not with older populations, for pretty straightforward reasons. If you look at the output of the world's great academics, the world's great researchers, most of the innovative work is done when these people are relatively young. You know, Isaac Newton stopped doing any significant science when he hit the age of 30. Einstein did almost nothing beyond the age of 35. Yeah. So we don't tend to associate innovation with population aging. So economies that rely increasingly on innovation and have fewer and fewer young people in them have a challenge. Similarly for entrepreneurship and investment, because these characteristics are associated with risk-taking. When you hit my age, and I just hit the magic age of 60, I can't be thinking about risking what little money I've been able to save in my life, because if I lose it all, I don't have any time left to make it back. So populations that are older tend to be very conservative when it comes to risk-taking with respect to financial endeavors, but also with respect to geopolitical endeavors. Older populations, older countries tend not to support going to war. This might in fact be a good thing. But what we might be witnessing, along with this shift in population to the developing countries of the world, the shift in global GDP to the developing countries in the world, we might also be witnessing a shift in geopolitical power and geopolitical influence to countries in the developing world. And this, of course, is something not to be taken lightly. When it comes to migration, a lot of people in our world see a wonderful fit here. Amit referred to this in his discussion of the EU and the possibility of the EU's enlargement to encompass Turkey and a few other countries. Whether or not this fit is going to be as magical as it might at first glance seem, I think remains to be seen. Yes, indeed, there are lots of very young people in the developing countries. But one thing, if we in the mature knowledge-based economies are looking to the developing world for its supply of labor as our people retire, one thing that we have to take into account is the capacity of the developing countries to produce university graduates who are going to be able to fill those roles in an innovation-based economy. So yes, there are lots of young people out there looking to move to the developed economies for work, but are they going to have the kinds of capacities that developed economies are going to be looking for? This is something that I think we need to look at in a little more detail. That having been said, the demand to migrate is going to be there, and we saw this in North Africa a few years ago, and we're going to see this in many other countries, because you've got these very young populations, and with increased levels of education, perhaps not at the level of what Europe and North American industry is looking for, nonetheless, with a level of education that is going to increase their expectations for meaningful labor, and so the demand to migrate is going to be very high, it seems to me. So there's a difficult situation on the horizon where you may have very limited opportunities, you may have very limited numbers of visas available for a very large number of young people who want to migrate. So that's going to put pressure on people like John Simmons, who looks after border matters. But it may provide extraordinary opportunities for people in the migrant smuggling business. Already, migrant smuggling is a very large business. It's a very lucrative business. And I'm not trying to be facetious here. It seems to me that this business is going to grow. I don't see any way that it's not going to grow. And the way that this business conducts itself, I think, is going to change. The days of putting large numbers of people into the backs of transport trucks or into their wheel housings or into the cargo areas of airplanes or the wheel houses of airplanes or rusty old boats. I think those days are going to come somewhat to an end, and smugglers are going to use more sophisticated means to do their work, including taking advantage of, again, the work of people like John to try to secure identities. We know that in Fujian province in China, the smugglers are relying less and less on boats and more on forged documents. And the documents that are being forged are not visas, but they're educational documents that allow these people to apply for visas in their preferred country of destination, and they actually get them. So when Fujian Chinese migrants enter the West, they're often doing so with fully legal documents from the West, where those documents were granted on fraudulent grounds. So it's not a surprise that this is happening, because everyone knows that the old-fashioned way of being smuggled in a rusty old boat or something is very risky. And smugglers are picking up the demand for less risky means of entering the country. And so John is going to have his hands full, as are people who are involved in border control around the world. Another thing, of course, that could result if we do see higher levels of migration, and I certainly do expect that we will see higher levels of migration in all directions, is a continued growth in the diversity of our populations. Steve Verdevick, of course, introduced or coined the term super diversity, and that I expect is going to increase in more and more countries. We know that migration inflows are changing patterns quite dramatically as developed populations are aging. So countries like Japan and Korea are, not necessarily the first time, but the first time in a while, looking very seriously at the migration option and are starting to look very seriously at the integration of immigrants. Korea is taking this seriously in ways that I've never seen before. Japan has its own version of multiculturalism as an emerging government policy. So this is happening. One of the more fascinating things that's resulting from this shift in the economic centers of the globe is what we might think of as, I suppose, circular migration or return migration, but the flows are starting to change. And countries like China are now becoming not only sending countries, but they're becoming receiving countries as China tries to transform its economy away from a low-wage manufacturing economy to a higher value-added, innovation-based economy. So as their expression goes, they want to move from a made-in-China economy to a designed-in-China economy, and that requires them to bring in all kinds of talent that their university systems are right now not able to produce in sufficient numbers, and so they're recruiting back very large numbers of scientists, engineers, designers from the West, whether they be Chinese nationals who migrated to the West or people who were born in the West and are being lured to China with a number of incentives, not just high salaries and attractive things like free houses and free Bentley sports cars, but working environments, laboratory environments that are world class. So I think what these trends are pointing to, and we're going to be talking about this at our conference in Tampere, we're looking at possibly a dramatic increase in competition, the level of competition for talent in the world. Because these numbers that Annette has given us point, it seems to be, now I'm not a scientist, but as someone who likes to read these things and think about these things, it seems to me that it's conceivable that in the short term, over the next 20 years, the globe's supply of innovation is going to decline, where the demand for this kind of innovative thinking or innovation potential is going to grow as more and more developing countries see their economies expand and transform, as is now being led in the case of China. So how, Ahmet, you suggested that Europe may want to look at migration as one of many solutions to its demographic deficit. How is Europe, or how are any of our countries going to compete successfully for a smaller and smaller, at least in the next generation, a smaller and smaller number of people with the kinds of skills, the kind of human capital that modern economies require? I don't exempt Canada from this concern. Canada has, of course, a pretty decent reputation when it comes to these things, but I'm very concerned that my country is being utterly complacent about this situation, that we simply think that we'll continue to be the default, along with Australia and New Zealand and America, the default place for people to go. Well, I'm not convinced by this, and it seems to me that governments in Canada, governments in Europe, even the United States, are going to have to be thinking hard about providing increasing incentives for the world's top talent to consider those countries as destinations. Jan, I think I'll quit there.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Is there any question for clarification for